Yeah.
I'd like to welcome everyone to the Center for Marxist Education. My name's Nick. I volunteer here. I'm also a union boilermaker and a member of the Communist Party. We're here today to listen to Doug Greene in his Red History Lecture Series. What number is this so far? We've been doing it
Six.
I've been doing it for several months here, covering some of the lesser known figures of, lesser known but still important figures of the communist movement. You know, there's not just 3 or 4 that everyone likes to discuss. But yeah, today it's the subject is Bukharin, favorite of the whole party, and I will turn it over to Doug. Let's give him a good welcome.
Okay, so I'll be talking on Nikolai Bukharin in just a moment. And just because of the nature of this talk, and to do justice to it, it's going to be longer than the other lectures I've done. And unfortunately, I had to leave important things out. For instance, I don't talk about that he was head of the Comintern, even though that's very important. And I'd ask that if you have any questions, comments, or whatnot, you save them to the end of the talk. And Nick didn't mention it, but I'm going to, is I'm also the author of a forthcoming book to be published on Louis-Auguste Blanqui, the French insurrectionary communist, that will probably be published in the next year or 2 from Haymarket Books. So I guess we can get started. So Bukharin, the favorite of the whole party. And after Bukharin's death in 1938, one of his adversaries said of him, Bukharin has 30 years of revolutionary work to his credit. And that was the final judgment of Leon Trotsky. And that was not without truth to it, because Bukharin had lived a life of deep revolutionary and intellectual commitment. He was one of the leading theorists and leaders of the Bolshevik Party, reaching the heights of power in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And he was a fierce proponent of the new economic policy and presented an alternative path of market socialism compared to the paths of both Trotsky and Stalin. He was an ally of Stalin during the party debates in the 20s, and Stalin declared, "We are and shall be for Bukharin." Trotsky considered Bukharin to be his greatest adversary in the party, and Bukharin found himself opposed to the methods of industrialization and collectivization pursued by the USSR at the end of the 1920s. And he was martyred during the most famous show trial in 1938 after a brilliant defense strategy which denied his guilt and exposed the monstrosity of those trials. Bukharin's ideas did not die with him, but were taken up by reforming currents within various Eastern Bloc communist parties who believed that Bukharin's program presented a more humane, balanced, pluralistic, and market-friendly socialism. I hope this talk can help present an overall outline of the life, ideas, and legacy of Nikolai Bukharin. So Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin was born on September 27, 1888 in Moscow, into a family of highly cultured and progressive teachers. He is inculcated with an urge to read and learn that remained constant throughout his life. By all accounts, Bukharin had a relatively happy childhood, remained close to his father throughout his life. Bukharin's early years is also movingly recalled by him in an autobiographical novel, How It All Began, that was written during his final prison term in the late 1930s. Like many of his generation, Bukharin was not untouched by the revolutionary storms which were erupting across the decrepit Tsarist empire, and that would ultimately bring it down. Early in life, Bukharin broke with religion and developed an affinity for nihilism. Yet by the time of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, he had adopted socialist views, and at 16 he was the leader of an illegal student socialist organization at Moscow University. And Moscow happened to be one of the regions where Bolshevism was stronger than the more moderate Mensheviks, and Bukharin was attracted to the more revolutionary Bolsheviks. He joined the Bolshevik underground in 1906, and he spent the next 4 years developing rapidly as a professional revolutionary, organizing, writing propaganda, while working for his university degree. By the age of 20, Bukharin's commitment and ability had elevated him to the leading Bolshevik in Moscow, which also brought him unwarranted police attention. And in 1909, he was arrested twice by the Tsarist police. And after the failure of the 1905 revolution, there was a major crackdown on the various currents of the left and popular movements by the Tsar state, which led to mass arrests and executions, and of course brought a major loss of members for the Bolshevik Party. Somehow Bukharin managed to continue his political work as an editor for a trade union newspaper and teaching in a political school. And in 1911, Bukharin was arrested due to his work due to the work of a double agent of the Tsar's police, Roman Bolensky, the head of the Bolshevik parliamentary delegation in the Duma. And after his arrest, Bukharin was convinced that Bolensky was the Tsar's agent, and later in exile tried to convince Lenin of this. Lenin refused to believe that one of the most effective Bolshevik agitators was actually a double agent, and this soured his relations with Bukharin. But as it would turn out, Bukharin was correct, and after the 1917 revolution, Bolensky would be exposed as a traitor and shot. Now, following his 1911 arrest, Bukharin escaped to Hanover, Germany, in order to live abroad. During his period of exile, which lasted until 1917, Bukharin lived alternatively in Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, England, Japan, and the United States, learning French, German, and English in the process. I wish I could. This was a period not only of intense political activity for Bukharin in the international socialist movement, but it was a creative period theoretically for him. By the time of the Russian Revolution, Bukharin was only 29, and he would be recognized as the most well-respected Bolshevik theorist, considered by many party members to be second only to that of Lenin. In exile, Bukharin met Lenin, whom he adored, Stalin, who he helped research on the national question, and Trotsky in American exile, where they collaborated on emigre publications. While in Vienna, Bukharin took up the task of debunking the work of the Austrian school of economics known as the Marginalists, who sought to refute Marx and his labor theory of value. Bukharin attended several lectures of the bourgeois economists Eugen von Bauerich and Friedrich von Wieser, listening closely to their arguments. The fruit of these ideas was Bukharin's 1914 work, The Economic Theory of the Leisure Class, which defended the orthodox Marxist position against the Austrians. Bukharin's critique drew on the existing criticisms of marginalism and combined the methodological criticism with that of sociology. In terms of methodology, Bukharin defended an orthodox Marxist position in regards to the study of political economy and society. And in regards to sociology, Bukharin argued that marginalism was the ideology of the rentier bourgeoisie, who had been eliminated from the process of production and were now parasitic on the economy. This work did a great deal to establish Bukharin as a serious Marxist thinker. The Economic Theory of the Leisure Class became the definitive Marxist statement on the Austrian school and was widely published in the Soviet Union. More than this, Bukharin showed that he was a Marxist who was not afraid to engage with rival schools of thought and willing to learn from them, at the same time that he was willing to fire shots of his own at them. The following year, Bukharin wrote a work on imperialism entitled Imperialism and the World Economy, which preceded Lenin's more famous work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, by several months. And until Bukharin's fall from power in 1929, the works of both Lenin and Bukharin were jointly honored as the definitive Bolshevik statements on imperialism. Yet Bukharin differed from Lenin on the number of points in regards to imperialism, as I will elaborate below. Bukharin's imperialism, like that of Lenin, was written in the midst of World War I, which we are now celebrating the 100th anniversary of the beginning, as the capitalist powers fought to determine which colonies would be enslaved by which group of capitalists and royalist vampires, which of course resulted in 10 million deaths. The major socialist parties of Europe had supported the war, and it also argued that imperialism, while deplorable, was not the inevitable development of capitalism. Analyzing why this colossal slaughter had taken place and the way forward for revolutionaries was thus no abstract theoretical exercise. Bukharin, who built on the work of the Austrian Marxist Rudolf Hilferd, looked at the growth of monopolies, trustification, and finance capital in modern capitalism as compared to the more competitive capitalism of that of Marx's time. Bukharin defined imperialism as the policy of finance capital and insisted that finance capital could follow no other course than an imperialist one. Finance capital sought out colonies for raw materials and to export surplus capital. And thus, far from being an aberration, this was essential to the structure of monopoly capitalism. Bukharin argued that competition between the imperialist powers for colonies and resources meant a periodic redivision of the world through war was thus inevitable. World War I was not an accident or the result of bad capitalist policy. It was an unavoidable result of modern capitalism and imperialism. Yet Bukharin also believed that while imperialism brought with it the horrors of war, it also unveiled the ripeness of contradictions that would lead to socialist revolution, a position that was similar to Lenin's. Yet in analyzing the contradictions of imperialism, Bukharin had overlooked a major one, the role of anti-colonial nationalism. In fact, during the war, Bukharin was opposed to all forms of nationalism and national self-determination, like that of along with Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Radek. And while opposition to the nationalism of the imperialist powers was certainly to be commended, Bukharin also lumped in the nationalism of the oppressed. Lenin, on the other hand, not only understood that nationalism had not grown exhausted, but in colonial countries it might possibly serve as a revolutionary force. The differing positions of Lenin and Bukharin led to friction between them. It is true that the argument of imperialism in the world economy is not compatible with an understanding of struggles for national liberation, something that Bukharin would later come to adopt. Now, returning to the main arguments of imperialism in the world economy, Bukharin argued that under imperialism, the development of trusts and monopolies proceeded at a dramatic pace. Smaller firms were eliminated or subordinated to the enormous trusts of finance capital. This meant that the economy became a combined enterprise or a national trust. Modern imperialism thus saw industrial and finance capital interests merge with that of the state, forming a giant state capitalist trust. And for Bukharin, the future inevitably belonged to state capitalism. The development of state capitalism meant that the state was now heavily intervening in the economy compared to earlier laissez-faire. In Bukharin's eyes, finance capital thus became a major organizer and owner of the state, as he called it, a colossal, almost monstrous power. Bukharin practically says that under imperialism, capitalism has managed to overcome the crises inherent in the system through the development of state capitalism. Lenin's work on imperialism did not argue that competition had been eliminated as completely as Bukharin claimed. Lenin believed that under imperialism, that the anarchy of the capitalist economy had not abolished internal crises and intensified both the anarchistic export of had in fact intensified those crises through the export of surplus capital, and that crises remained. Bukharin argued that competition between the imperialist powers for colonies, later in a short essay, Towards the Theory of the Imperialist State, written shortly after his book on imperialism, Bukharin further elaborated on his view in regards to imperialism, but also the Marxist view of the state. His central argument was that, and I quote, "In the first place, the imperialist epoch is one of intense struggle on the part of the state capitalist trust, with the result that the question of the state's military might acquires enormous importance. In the second place, this same epoch also gives unprecedented significance to state power in the internal life of the peoples, the tentacle of this monster penetrating every crack and embracing every aspect of social life," end quote. Bukharin's vision was haunting. The imperialist state was being a new Leviathan, with an iron heel clamped down on the neck of the proletariat and the press. And towards the end of his work on the imperialist state, Bukharin made this starting conclusion, and I quote, "Any further development of the state organisms before the socialist revolution is possible only in the form of a militaristic state capitalism. Centralization is becoming the centralization of a barracks. In the upper stratum of society, a vile military clique is inevitably growing astray, resulting in brutal drilling and bloody repression of the proletariat. On the other hand, we have already seen that any activity by the proletariat under these conditions is inevitably directed against state power. Hence, a definite tactical demand. Social democracy must forcibly underline its hostility, in principle, to state power." Bukharin argued that communists should not seize this state, but smash it. For Marxists who had been schooled in the ways of the Second International, to say this was to be branded an anarchist. Lenin was adamantly opposed to Bukharin's conclusions in regards to the state. Lenin argued that Bukharin's argument was semi-anarchistic, a political and theoretical error, a misrepresentation of Marx and Engels, and that revolutionaries needed to seize the existing state apparatus. Lenin also argued that Bukharin denied the need for a proletarian state, but this was not true, since Bukharin did argue for a temporary state during the transitional period. The polemics between the two men was fierce, and in 1916 it seemed that Bukharin had been alienated from Lenin. Bukharin, in fact, instead an olive branch to Lenin to avoid a complete breach, saying, and if more people would do this, it'd be kind of interesting, "If you must polemicize, etc., preserve such a tone that it will not lead to a split. I look upon you as my revolutionary teacher, and I love you." Lenin, who maintained his differences with Bukharin, toned things down, and the two men continued to work together. However, Bukharin ended up with the last laugh. His reinterpretation of the state caused Lenin to rethink his position, and he promised to investigate the matter further. So in early 1917, Lenin began his own research on the Marxist view of the state, which eventually became the foundation of his major work, The State and the Revolution. And in this work, Lenin argued that the fundamental lesson of Marx and Engels in regards to the bourgeois state was that the working class must break, smash, and destroy it, and replace it with a dictatorship of the proletariat. This perspective of Lenin's would guide the practice of the Bolshevik Party during the 1917 revolution. And when Bukharin returned to Russia in 1917, the first thing Lenin's wife said to him was, "Vladimir Ilyich asked me to tell you that he no longer has disagreements with you on the question of the state." And while it is true that Lenin did write the major treatise on the Marxist view of the state, we should never forget that the initial impetus came from Bukharin. And following the February Revolution of 1917, Bukharin returned to Russia. And Bukharin's position in the party was remarkably high. He's not only head of the Moscow Party organization, but an editor for the major revolutionary paper Pravda. And in August 1917, he was elected to the Central Committee, where he took an active part in planning for the October Revolution. And during this time, Bukharin was on the party's far left, arguing for the overthrow of the provisional government and the transfer of power to the Soviets, transforming the imperialist war into a civil one. And he possessed an impatient insurrectionary streak. He wanted to take power in July 1917. And Bukharin and his co-thinkers were maximalists in their demands and aims, little open to compromise, and they often came off as self-righteous and inflexible. And in 1917, Bukharin was involved in the planning and the execution of the bloody Moscow uprising. And in early 1918, as Soviet power was shakily established across the former Russian Empire, Bukharin was now a key player in the politics of revolutionary Russia. Bukharin, perhaps more than any other Bolshevik leader, including Lenin, Trotsky, was intoxicated by the idea of a European revolution and refused to compromise on this position. While all the Bolsheviks wanted revolution in the major capitalist powers, they had to contend with the realities of a war-torn and ruined country without an army. The Bolsheviks had also come to power promising an end to the war with Germany. And in 1918, the Bolsheviks planned to conclude a peace with Imperial Germany. And after long negotiations conducted by Trotsky at Brest-Litovsk, the Germans placed an ultimatum on Russia that included harsh peace terms, the loss of territory, resources, industry, and population to the Germans. Lenin argued that the Bolsheviks had to accept the treaty, since they had no way to resist and needed to preserve the Soviet Republic until the World Revolution broke out. Bukharin and his radical comrades, who were known as the left communists, argued against accepting the draconian peace terms and for continuing the war against Germany. Bukharin did not argue for war as a Russian patriot, but as a communist. He wanted a revolutionary war and believed that even if the Soviets had to retreat beyond the Urals, this would rally support from the Russian and international proletariat to their struggle, and this would in turn lead to the overthrow of capitalism. Bukharin's plan was willing to gamble the loss of power in the hopes of sparking off an international revolution, and not even Trotsky was willing to accept such a plan. Needless to say, Bukharin's position was outvoted by the party, and the Brest Treaty was grudgingly accepted. Yet Bukharin remained on the far left of the Bolshevik Party during the years of civil war. He was not only a member of the Central Committee, but in 1919 he was elected to the executive of the Communist International, or the Comintern. And his record on the Comintern, which would last in varying degrees for the next 10 years, was less than stellar. For instance, Bukharin bears some responsibility for the disastrous March action of the German Communist Party in 1921. However, Bukharin also further established his international reputation among communists by co-authoring the official party textbook, The ABCs of Communism, in 1919 with Preobrazhensky, a Bolshevik economist and later a Trotskyist opponent of Bukharin. The ABC was an elaboration of the Bolshevik Party program and served as a popular introduction of the principles of communism for millions of militants. The ABCs was practically the communist Bible and was more well known than the works of leading communists such as Lenin and Trotsky. This book established Bukharin's fame in communist circles, where he was dubbed the golden boy of the revolution. During the Russian Civil War, the Soviet Republic had to institute an emergency policy known as war communism that established state control of the economy, requisitioned grain from the peasantry in order to feed the cities and the army, which was commanded by Trotsky. While war communism enabled the Bolsheviks to win the Civil War, by 1921 the country was falling apart as industry collapsed and sections of the peasantry were rising up. While war communism enabled the Soviet state to win the war, it did come at that horrific cost. And despite the cost, there were some Bolsheviks who did see war communism as leading directly to communism. And Bukharin is generally presented as a proponent of war communism, believing that this was indeed the case. But he did support whole-scale nationalizations, planning the economy, and moving directly into communism. And certainly Bukharin acknowledged the sacrifice that revolution demanded, saying, "It is a miserable reformist illusion to imagine a transition to socialism without the crash, without the destruction of social equilibrium, and without a bloody struggle." Later in a speech to the Comintern, Bukharin declared, "There are many thorns upon our path, but we must go forward, undaunted. The great revolution which is turning the old world upside down cannot go smoothly. The great revolution cannot be carried out in white gloves. It is born in pain. These birth pangs must be gone through with infinite patience. When doubly born, they will serve to free us from the iron grip of capitalist slavery." I'd like to complicate the picture that Bukharin believed that war communism was bringing Russia to communism. For instance, in the ABC of Communism, Bukharin is often interpreted, even by sympathetic biographers, as arguing that war communism was the Marxist ideal. And there's a passage where he goes on about, under communism, about statistical bureaus. But if you read the passage, it's too long, I'm not going to read it here, is when Bukharin is describing these statistical bureaus, he's merely restating a traditional socialist narrative of a society without bosses and crises. And this is clear if one looks at the sources cited in this chapter, the ABC, which are old-school social democratic literature. Furthermore, Bukharin's work, Economics of the Transitional Period, is said to be a theoretical justification for war communism, but I believe it should be read with more nuance. In one passage, Bukharin is arguing that the rebirth of industry is needed for socialism, and he's arguing for establishing a proper balance of equilibrium between both the town and the country. Bukharin says that in Soviet Russia, the current equilibrium between town and country is maintained by coercion, and he saw the main path of equilibrium between the town and country had to be one of mutual advantage to both the workers and the peasants, something that he will continually emphasize in the 20s. And the coercive measures used against the peasantry are also explicitly described as an emergency measure undertaken by the Soviet Union. Bukharin's 1921 work, Historical Materialism, A System of Sociology, came under heavy criticism both within Russia and abroad. Bukharin's Historical Materialism was an attempt to explain and popularize Marxist theory through the categories of sociology, which showed his continual engagement with bourgeois social sciences. Yet Bukharin's work was preoccupied with absolutes and minimized internal contradictions of society, a major problem with his dialectical method. And according to Bukharin, every society was to be understood as a social system that maintained a stable level of equilibrium. And he says, the stability of any social equilibrium, that is, the equilibrium among different groups of human society, depends on a certain equilibrium first being established between society and its external environment. Bukharin's work stressed equilibrium, and there were certainly positive environmental aspects to his stress on equilibrium, arguing for a balance between society and nature. For Bukharin, equilibrium became a desirable goal because it ensured systemic survival. Yet this was a marked contrast to Bukharin's argument only a short time before, when he argued that it is only a short time before, and a number of Marxists criticized historical materialism, such as George Lukács, Antonio Gramsci, and Lenin. To Lukács, Bukharin's work showed the problems that came from systemizing and popularizing Marxist theory. Bukharin is simplified based on superstructure. His methodology of imperialism was closer to the bourgeois natural sciences than dialectics. And he argued that the social revolution, and Lukács is saying that Bukharin is arguing that social revolution could be predicted like the same way as a scientific phenomena could, even though the methods and predictions of natural and social sciences were vastly different. Bukharin argued for technological determinism as well. And Gramsci shared many of the same arguments as Lukács, also adding that Bukharin's Marxism was undialectical, banal, and crude, and resembling the deterministic Marxism of the Second International. In fact, Gramsci, while imprisoned by fascist Italy, would devote hundreds of pages to lengthy philosophical and political criticism of Bukharin's historical materialism. Lenin said that Bukharin, in using sociological categories, was taking a step backward, and he lacked the concreteness when discussing classes and class struggles. According to Lenin, Bukharin's dialectical approach would forget and ignore tendencies he had identified operated in concrete circumstances alongside other counter-tendencies, and this led in political practice from Bukharin jumping from one extreme to another. It also meant that Bukharin proved to be ineffective in conceiving the possibilities and strategies of a particular conjuncture, which would ultimately rank him as a poor political leader. Furthermore, Lenin also had been politically opposed to Bukharin during the 1921 trade union debate, where Bukharin had supported Trotsky's call to incorporate trade unions into the state machine as part of the militarization of the labor force. And in 1923, as Lenin lay dying, he wrote in his testament, which contained his final opinion on various party leaders. And his final words of Bukharin were full of warm praise and deep criticism. And Lenin said of Bukharin, Bukharin is not only the most valuable and major theorist of the party, he's also rightly considered the favorite of the whole party. But his theoretical reviews can be classified as fully Marxist only with great reserve, for there is something scholastic about him. He's never made a study of the dialectic, and I think never fully understood it, end quote. And while Lenin's criticism in regards to Bukharin's dialectics was correct, later in life Bukharin would overcome this deficiency, which we'll talk about later. And as mentioned earlier, Bukharin moved to the right of the Bolshevik Party. This shift was not only due to his movement from one extreme to another, but to the changed international and domestic situation confronting the Soviet Union. By the early 1920s, the hopes of the Soviet Union being rescued by an international revolution had grown increasingly remote. It was now clear that the Soviet Union would have to develop socialism with its own resources, and no outside aid. And Bukharin came to believe that the Soviet path to socialism lay through the new economic policy. The new economic policy, known as the NEP, was instituted in 1921 following the conclusion of the Civil War in order to provide breathing space for the Bolsheviks and restore production. The NEP relaxed state control over the economy, allowing small businesses and private trade, ending requisitions, and permitting the development of a money economy. And by 1927, NEP had restored Soviet industry and agriculture to its pre-war levels, but it also led to the growth of a class of rich peasants known as the kulaks and private traders known as the netmen. And during the 1920s, as the country recovered, several factions developed within the Bolshevik Party, each with their own differing ideas on how to develop socialism, ranging from Stalin, Bukharin's main ally, to Trotsky and Preobrazhensky on the left. Bukharin, now at the pinnacle of power in the party and the Comintern, became the official theorist and ideologue for the NEP as Russia's path to socialism. It is to Bukharin's ideas on how Russia would develop socialism that we must now turn. What follows is a very rough outline of Bukharin's position, drawing not only on his writings at this time, but commentary by Moshe Levine and Stephen Cohen. Bukharin began with the premise that power is in the hands of the proletariat, and that the working class is thus shaping policy. In order for socialism to develop, it was necessary for the guiding aim of the government to secure its alliance with the whole of the peasantry. In the end, this would ensure the survival of the Soviet Union. However, Bukharin recognized that there were difficulties in dealing with the peasantry. The peasants were, in their majority, small property owners, with no political experience and open to bourgeois influences. The peasants had divided loyalties. On the one hand, Bukharin believed that the peasantry needed socialism, but they did not possess a comprehension of that fact. On the other hand, the proletariat wants socialism, but is not anxious to share power with other classes. Therefore, the NEP was needed to secure the worker-peasant alliance and to build socialism. This meant that Bukharin's conclusion with socialism would be achieved through the laws of the market economy. Bukharin said that agriculture would develop towards socialism, since the peasantry would operate under the dual pressure of self-interest and state guidance. This double combination would lead to an increase in the size of farms, crop yields, and make farms more profitable. According to Bukharin, this would benefit the whole of the peasantry. And so Bukharin declared in a rather infamous statement, "Overall, we say to the entire peasantry, to its different strata, enrich yourselves, accumulate, develop your farms. Only idiots say that the poor must always be with us. We must now implement policy which will result in the disappearance of poverty. Needless to say, these remarks came under heavy criticism from Trotsky and the left opposition, who believed that Bukharin was downplaying the kulak danger. Bukharin did not argue for the peasantry to develop production wholly on market mechanisms, but following the last writings of Lenin, to expand their farms using cooperatives. However, in order for cooperatives to expand, the peasantry needed a way to collectively purchase, sell, and gain credit. Bukharin believed that by providing state aid, that the cooperative sector, along with cultivation, would gradually increase. And as cooperatives proved their worth, the peasantry would gradually become collectivized and draw closer to the state and industry. While Bukharin argued for a much slower pace of industrialization than Trotsky and the left opposition, and he did say that socialism was developed at a snail's pace, he understood that the Soviet Union did need industry to function efficiently and to be capable of satisfying the needs of the countryside. Bukharin also believed that because industry was controlled by the state, it was socialist and thus superior to market mechanisms. Therefore, it would develop faster than the rural sector. One thing that Bukharin repeatedly argued was that in order to gain the support of the peasantry, then it was absolutely necessary that the cooperation be voluntary. He took aim at Trotsky and Brzezinski for wanting to exploit and extract tribute from the peasantry in order to develop industry, which was not actually their positions, or not without the nuances they had on them. Key to Bukharin's approach to socialist development was that the class struggle would have to change character. And in fact, for his ideas to be successful, there would have to be equilibrium and class peace. This meant that all peasants, even the kulaks, needed to be allowed to take part in economic life free of coercion, which would allow the state to use funds generated in the countryside to develop industry. Bukharin thought that a market economy could be utilized by the Soviet Union to build socialism, provided it was strictly controlled. The state sector and industry controlled by the proletariat would ultimately become a more effective competitor than the bourgeois sector and develop its productive forces faster, better, and cheaper. Ultimately, socialism would prove itself by developing to its fullest potential in the economic sphere. And it should be noted that Bukharin, and actually Trotsky too, didn't say much about the role of collective farms, since he believed their development lay far in the future, once industry could provide the necessary resources to allow them to flourish and outproduce small farms. And while Bukharin did argue that the kulaks were an alien capitalist element in the countryside, he also held that they should be allowed to build cooperatives, and that kulak cooperatives could be moved in a socialist direction determined within the framework that was established by the Soviet state. Bukharin's approach, by his own admission, ensured a slow progress towards socialism. He was not only worried about capitalist intervention, and the International Revolution was not actually foremost on his mind, even though he was head of the Comintern. Although Bukharin did think that the Soviet Union needed an international revolution to survive, but he believed that to prepare the Soviet Union for this revolution, it needed to be kept stable, and to maintain equilibrium and develop industry. The support of the whole peasantry and their alliance with the working class was thus the linchpin of his whole strategy. Bukharin's dream of a gradual development towards socialism fell apart in the late 1920s. Although the new economic policy was successful in allowing the Soviet Union to recover industry and agriculture, it had generated class differentiation in the countryside. The NEP had never quite solved the problem of equilibrium between the town and country. Chief among the factors explaining the imbalance was the peasants, who produced a great deal of grain, could only sell to the towns at high prices due to the backwardness of industry. However, Bukharin, in promoting a slow pace of industrial development, in fact allowed industry to stagnate while the peasants accumulated. This merely aggravated the shortage of goods for the peasantry to buy and fostered their distrust in cooperating with the Soviet state. And by 1927, there were acute food shortages in the cities as the peasantry refused to sell, wanting higher prices. And by 1927, Bukharin was starting to change his positions, beginning to advocate an increased rate of industrialization, more emphasis on planning, higher taxes on the kulak, and the development of a voluntary collective farm sector within the framework of the NEP. At the same time, sections of the left opposition, such as Brzezinski, were moving towards some of Bukharin's positions, lowering their sights of industrial development as well. However, in late 1927, Bukharin's proposals could not quite cope with the magnitude of the situation in the countryside. Soviet imports and production were falling as grain collections fell off, anywhere between a third to a half. In response to this grain strike, the party instituted extraordinary measures throughout the countryside, with activists and volunteers and members of the secret police sent to collect grain. The use of coercion against the peasantry was able to collect grain, but it inevitably led to the development of class war in the countryside, as the party embarked on a campaign of collectivization and liquidating the kulaks as a class. And this meant a break with Bukharin and the NEP. Furthermore, Stalin began a campaign of industrialization to develop the economy and provide machinery for the collective farms and the 5-year plans to develop in the USSR. Yet planning was done at an accelerated rate and breakneck speeds, beyond anything proposed either by Trotsky or Brzezinski, and certainly beyond anything proposed by Bukharin. The focus was on achieving growth and developing heavy industry, without the balanced growth Bukharin had championed. Bukharin also believed that the campaign of collectivization would alienate the peasantry and ruin the revolution. All this led him into conflict with the party line and Stalin. Bukharin and his right opposition attacked the party line in Pravda and other organs. One of the most famous of Bukharin's writings opposed to collectivization was the Notes of an Economist, which, while seemingly attacking Trotsky's policies, was actually a veiled attack on Stalin, since none of those policies were actually proposed by Trotsky. He warned of disaster for the Soviet Union if Stalin's line was pursued. However, Bukharin kept most of his criticisms veiled using Aesopian language and behind closed doors, not daring to openly oppose Stalin. Even though Bukharin was deeply opposed to Trotsky and the left opposition, he was willing to ally with them against Stalin. Trotsky saw Bukharin and still saw Bukharin as his main enemy, declaring, "With Stalin against Bukharin, yes. With Bukharin against Stalin, never." But this was not quite true. For Trotsky was willing to make a limited pact with Bukharin to restore inter-party democracy, but would not compromise his fundamental ideas. Yet the alliance between the former left and right oppositions fell through because the rank-and-file followers in both camps were too distrustful of each other and thwarted the pact, even though the leadership in both camps wanted it. Over time, Trotsky came to see the validity of many of Bukharin's points about the dangers of prematurely abolishing the NEP and the market, arguing in 1932 that when Stalin allowed private plots on collective farms, that all-around collectivization extraordinarily lowered the labor incentives available to the peasantry. The answer to this was the legalization of trade. In other words, it was partly necessary to restore the NEP of the free market, which was abolished too soon and too definitely. And Trotsky went on in the 1932 work, The Soviet Economy in Danger, that planning needed to make use of the market. And he says here, and I quote, "The innumerable living participants in the economy, state and private and collective and collective and individual, must serve notice of their needs and of their relative strength, not only through the statistical determinations of the plan commissions, but by the direct pressure of supply and demand. The plan is checked and to a considerable degree realized through the market. The regulation of the market itself must depend upon the tendencies that are brought to bear out through its mechanism. The blueprints produced by the departments must demonstrate their economic efficiency through commercial calculation." Bukharin's right opposition, and this in a sense was a movement, Trotsky moved slightly to the right in many of his positions, towards a position that would be, I would argue, not too dissimilar than something Bukharin could have written 4 or 5 years previously. Bukharin's right opposition was ultimately defeated within the party in 1929, and he made a public recantation. And this led to the loss of position in the Politburo, his editorship of Pravda, removal from the Comintern, and a restriction of his writings in regards to politics and theory. Yet he remained on the Central Committee and an influential voice within the Soviet Union. He moved toward an acceptance of the official party line in the 30s. And he wrote and studied on questions of industrial organization, planning, philosophy, and science. And in 1934, he was made an editor on Izvestia. And in 1936, he helped write the new Soviet Constitution. He was a proponent of socialist humanism and an anti-fascist, an advocate for the Popular Front and alliances with Western powers against the growing threat of Nazi Germany. Yet the seeming mood of liberalization ended in the mid-1930s with the onset of the Great Purge. The purges saw hundreds of thousands of dedicated party members, army officers, and ordinary Soviet citizens arrested and executed en masse on charges of being in league with foreign powers, wrecking, spying, etc. Most of the leaders of the 1917 revolution were also accused of being part of a vast counter-revolutionary terrorist conspiracy tied to Trotsky, the Nazis, and various foreign powers. This was supposedly proved when all these Bolsheviks confessed during 3 public show trials in 1936, 7, and 8. Since that time, not a single shred of evidence has come forward to corroborate any of these confessions. As such, they are without foundation, and not only were all these communists innocent, but they were murdered. Bukharin was himself put on trial during the most famous show trial in 1938. He was arrested in 1937, initially refusing to confess for 2 months, and he held out under interrogation. And while there is no evidence he was ever tortured, he did send letters to Stalin begging for his life. However, considering the atmosphere in the Soviet Union during this period, the fear of arbitrary and summary punishment was a real threat hanging over both Bukharin and his family. And when Bukharin's young wife and child were threatened, he relented and agreed to publicly confess at trial. And during the year when he was in prison before trial, he wrote a number of works, one of which was How It All Began. A second was a collection of poems. A third was a book, Socialism and its culture, focusing on issues of culture, ideology, and philosophy related to socialism. However, I'd like to say a few words about a single work of Bukharin, the Philosophical Arabic Skies. This work was a systematic work on Marxist philosophy, defending it against all challengers. Bukharin's work contains a defense of Hegel and shows a close reading of Lenin's philosophical notebooks. Bukharin openly defended a humanistic Marxism and differentiated himself from the Dimat, which was the short term for Soviet philosophy, and Second International Determinism, and argued that Bukharin finally got Lenin's point in his testament and overcame his lack of understanding in regards to the dialectic. Now to the final drama of Bukharin's life, which was his trial. Bukharin's trial took place from March 2nd to March 12th, 1938. And Bukharin, along with multiple other defendants, were accused of being ringleaders of a block of rights and Trotskyites, who were in league with at least 6 or 7 foreign powers: Britain, Poland, Japan, Germany. I believe France is in there, Trotsky, and were engaged in espionage, treason, wrecking, and plotting to assassinate the Soviet leadership and to launch a military coup to restore capitalism in Russia. And this conspiracy was so far-reaching that in 1918, Bukharin was supposedly working with Trotsky to murder Lenin in the midst of civil war. While nearly all of Bukharin's co-defendants confessed to these charges, he developed an interesting trial tactic. Knowing he was going to die, Bukharin cooperated with the prosecution and admitted his overall guilt in the conspiracy, yet he denied every specific charge. In effect, Bukharin wrecked the show. Bukharin's opening statement shows his approach, and I quote, "Consequently, I plead guilty to what directly follows from this, the sum total of crimes committed by this counter-revolutionary organization, irrespective of whether or not I knew of, whether or not I took direct part in any particular act." And during the trial, he repeatedly denied charges and refused to answer questions. His testimony was filled with all kinds of hidden messages and Aesopian language. Bukharin continually frustrated the prosecutors and even cross-examined witnesses. At one point, the prosecutor Vajinsky spewed vitriol against Bukharin, saying during a long closing speech that called for the defendants to be shot like dogs, Bukharin shrinks from the admission of his guilt as the devil from incense. Bukharin denies his guilt here. Yet Bukharin not only wanted to refute the charges against him, but in his own words, he was appealing to the verdict of history. World history is a world court of judgment, he said. Bukharin was defending not only his personal honor, but the honor of Bolshevism, and challenging the official narrative of Stalin before a much larger audience. And in a single line near the end of Bukharin's closing statement, he declared his whole testimony as worthless with a single statement: "The confession of the accused is not essential. The confession of the accused is a medieval principle of jurisprudence." And it should remember that the show trials were built wholly on confessions and possessed no physical proof whatsoever. So Bukharin declared that all his testimony and the trials in general not only based on medieval and savage methods of justice, and thereby condemned the whole justice system of the Soviet Union. Bukharin was able to defend his honor and turn the tables on his accusers, but this, of course, did not change his fate, and he was shot on March 15, 1938, as an enemy of the people. But this is not the last word that can be said on Bukharin. The charges against him were so fraudulent and outlandish that no reasonable person could believe them after honest scrutiny. Thus, following Stalin's death, there were efforts by Bukharin's widow to overturn the verdict and rehabilitate him and restore him to party membership. Khrushchev wanted to, but didn't get around to it, but it was achieved in 1988 when Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet government removed those charges and restored him to party membership posthumously. Part of the reason that Gorbachev supported Bukharin's rehabilitation is he found much of support in Bukharin's ideas. In fact, though Bukharin was condemned and his ideas were considered heretical and counter-revolutionary, there remained an undercurrent in opposition and reform communist currents in the Eastern Bloc. Bukharin was seen as a representative of a socialism that was consumer-friendly, with balanced planning and growth, humanistic, and market-based. For many reformers, Bukharin represented a viable alternative to the system Stalin had created. With his advocacy of continuing the new economic policy, but it should also be argued that Gorbachev's advocacy of Bukharin could also be considered taking his ideas to their final conclusion. While Bukharin could not have known the end result of his ideas for a market socialism, but when Gorbachev let the market and the law of value flourish in his effort to reform, it did not lead to the harmonious growth and flourishing of socialism in the Soviet Union, but to its complete dissolution and the development of a gangster capitalism. Maybe I'm just being redundant. I don't need gangster when I talk about capitalism. The question remains, though, to what extent were Bukharin's ideas and the advocacy of a NEP a socialist alternative to both Trotsky and Stalin? For one, Bukharin's plan hinged on the relaxation of the class struggle, a form worker-peasant alliance under the NEP that would allow harmonious growth and steady industrialization. Yet the policies Bukharin advocated actually intensified the class and strained the class alliance between the peasantry, and ultimately led to the end of the NEP, and the immense problems of laying the foundations for economic development in the industrial sphere, such as finding the resources and establishing a planning system in isolation, would have existed no matter who led the Soviet Union. If Bukharin had won out, it is possible to imagine a slower and steadier industrialization, no purges, but the question remains if this would be socialism, and if Bukharin's plans could meet the danger of war. I would argue no on both counts. And while Bukharin's ideas have outlived him, it seems that their implementation did not represent an alternative of socialism with a human face that it was later called at all, but ultimately led straight back to capitalism. All of this being said, I think that despite all the judgments and contradictions of Bukharin's life and legacy, I would like to leave the final word to him in his letter to future party leaders, which was only read more than 50 years after his death. And he said, "Remember, comrades, that on the red flag you carry on the victorious road toward communism lies a drop of my blood as well." That's all. So again, it was a huge topic, and there was stuff I had to cut out, stuff I couldn't say, just because I wanted to keep it short, but not, and it apparently wasn't as short as I wanted it to be, but that's okay. But if you've got comments, concerns, objections, etc., now is the time. Sure.
It sounds like his wife survived,
yes,
so that his intent of supposedly confessing worked.
Yes.
I guess that's the...
His wife did survive. She died in 1994.
Excellent. And his children, I assume
he had,
survived.
as far as I know, he had one child with his second wife, who I don't know if he's still alive, actually. And he had a daughter with a first wife in like 1910. I have no idea what happened.
So his impertinence at trial
yes.
didn't blow back and hurt his family?
No. I mean, they were sent, his son was sent to an orphanage, and his wife was sent to the camps.
Yeah.
But they did live. That's true.
They did survive.
That's true. Because his wife did write a memoir, This I Cannot Forget, which, you know, is interesting reading. Yes, in the back.
I just had a question. You made an interesting point about humanism a few times.
Mm-hmm.
But anything I've read by him, and I haven't read a lot, I admit it, I never saw any point where his current or he took any steps, nuanced or not, to oppose the mass killings and jailings of the left's opposition of the left
No, he didn't.
communists, of the United Opposition. Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean. He was an ally of Stalin. I did say that. He supported Stalin. He did not support the left opposition.
So I don't see how
But he did oppose Trotsky's.
Humanism.
Well, this was something he developed more in the 30s, I'd argue.
Okay.
Especially if you read some of those last prison writings,
Okay.
it really comes out. But he did oppose sending Trotsky into exile. He voted against that.
Okay, I didn't know that. Thank you.
So,
Yeah.
so he didn't
Thank you
support.
for. Thank you.
But in general, he really, and in his arguments with the various currents of the left, he definitely misrepresented a lot of what they were saying. Because there would be moments when they would start to move closer together, the two currents, on certain issues, as I think I've tried to lay it out. Yes, I'm sorry.
Do the ruling parties of Vietnam and China have any sort of position on Bukharin? Because they both seem to have almost a NEP on steroids.
We were actually talking about this earlier.
Steroids, yeah.
I actually don't know. We were actually talking about that before the talk. But, Nick.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've heard people say that the Chinese, the cooperative farming system was more in line with what Bukharin advocated, and I just never knew if they drew on Bukharin's work or came to those conclusions separately on their own.
That I can't say. You had a...
Yeah, well, actually, I was recently in Vietnam, and also when I was in Cuba, we directly asked the communists there that question, and basically they said, we've studied the new economic policy very seriously. We have a great deal of respect for what they would call a Leninist policy of the 1920s. Our policy has references that, is the way they put it. But we have an independent policy based on our own national characteristics. So they seem to have studied the policy and learned from it, but also kind of have also their own policy.
Yeah,
That's what they said.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I do listen to a program on WBAI in New York City at noon, usually on Saturdays today, with Rick Wolff,
Yep.
You know him, he's a Marxist economist at the New School in New York City. He seems to be a big advocate of the worker self-directed enterprises as has been established in Mondragon in the Basque province of Spain. All right, and I was wondering if there was any kind of a connection, maybe coming from Spain when after this time of the Spanish Civil War, having embraced any of the ideas of Nikolai Bukharin at all.
Okay, I actually can speak to that. There actually was an international right opposition.
Yes.
And loosely based on, Bukharin had supporters in various international communist parties.
Yeah.
The German, the Spanish, the American, etc. And in Spain, his supporters, they formed something called the Worker Peasant Bloc under Joaquin Marin.
Marin, yeah.
So they were largely based in Catalonia, and they were expelled from the official Spanish Communist Party around 1930. And to give a very brief summation, they opposed a lot of the foreign policies of the Soviet Union, but they supported most of the domestic policies. And they eventually fused with the Trotskyist organization in Spain called the Communist Left under Andreas Nin in 1935-36 to form the PUM, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unity, which was essentially wiped out by the end of the Civil War. And but then again, all left parties were essentially wiped out by the end of the Civil War.
This would have happened after, this would have been in the 50s.
Yeah, I know Mondragon is later, but the thing, I mean, I'm certain,
It was a priest that started it.
I mean, for one thing,
It's
Bukharin,
kind of strange.
the thing with Mondragon is, and I'm going to seem kind of mean saying this, but, if Mondragon was such a threat to Francoist Spain, it would have been bombed into oblivion in the 50s. I mean, I'm serious. Bukharin never denied the need for the proletariat to seize power and to smash the state. Mondragon, in many respects, it represents a lot of great ideas, an idea of an alternative, but it has not supplanted capitalism. To that, you need to do what Bukharin says, that principle of hostility to bourgeois state power. I mean, probably there are some ideas, but I think it probably developed independently of any consideration of Bukharin, and I think it was actually developed by Catholic priests.
Yeah, it was.
So,
I know.
yeah.
Yeah, it was true. The thing about it is, in this situation, this world that we have now, where we have nuclear weapons, okay, of, well, I'm going to say of the United States, because they were the ones that had used the bomb, all right, in World War II. Okay, I'm just going to say, if this is still, if in other groups have this capability too, and if there is a political diatribe or a struggle going on in other parts of the world involving the kind of struggle we're talking about in an ideological viewpoint. In other words, that we would use physical, more than, well, it's physical force, but it's kind of viewing the notion of this notion of nuclear energy being used as a method of struggle in this time, in 2014. I don't know if that's going to be something that we can do in a rational sense. I just don't see it happening. We have to do. There has to be something. There has to be another method, and it might have to be something at a much lower, hopefully lower level of struggle, which will be different than that because of that capability that exists on both sides.
Yeah, also I can say about, I'm not an expert on nuclear energy or its application. My friend edits a magazine, a journal called Cultural Logic, and there was an article in it by Greg Myerson on nuclear energy and socialism. You might want to check that out. But I can't speak to that with any expertise, so I'm just not going to. Yes?
I just wanted to thank everyone again for coming, and I was going to ask Doug to pass around the money bucket, because believe it or not, the Center for Marxist Education has no corporate sponsors.
I need change, so I'll get it back.
So, yeah, we pay the rent by doing events and people making the donations they can, so we appreciate it.
I'm sorry, you in the back had...
Oh, yeah, two questions of clarification.
Sure.
One is, I'm wondering if you could elaborate on his claim that marginalism is the ideology of the working class. And then the second is, I'm not very clear on the criticisms of Bukharin's use of sociological categories in his version of historical imperialism.
Well, Bukharin, in economic theory of the leisure class, is arguing that the marginalists are taking a view of a bourgeoisie that is largely removed from the process of production. The coupon clippers, the cutters, and he's saying that their philosophy, they're so far removed from the process of production that they see, that they just deny the labor theory of value. And Jim, would you? I mean, you are much more...
He was defending the labor theory of value.
Yeah.
He actually intended to write, the economic theory of leisure class was directed against the early Austrian school. He talks about some of the other modular schools too.
Right.
And he actually intended to write a second book that would take aim at the other modulus. He never got around to that.
Can you, what were you, and about the sociology?
Well, actually, before we move to that,
oh, sure.
I don't know much about marginal utility theory, but I have looked at the textbook, and there is presented as production function. You know, you have so many units of extra capital, right? You get so much increase in output. It seems to be the basic idea. So, can you? How is that ideological?
I mean, how is it ideology? I mean, ideology of lived practice?
Because it just seems like a sort of a technical relationship. You know, you have so many workers, you have so much capital, and then you add so many units of land, right, and that will have an effect on output. And he seems to think that that sort of theorizing isn't ideological.
Well, he's arguing that the people who are presenting this are representatives of a class removed from production. That's more or less what he's arguing. And in denying that the fact that it's labor essentially that creates, you know, through its interaction with nature, you know, that land would never get developed without workers developing it. That capital in Bukharin and the Marxist view is stored dead labor that has been produced. And the labor theory of value has to be the basis of any view of modern economy and society.
Right. I mean, okay, we don't have to get into that. This is something I struggle with the labor
Sure.
theory of value, which is that, you know, the workers obviously need the tools and the land also
Yeah.
to do what they do, right? So I don't see what's wrong. Again, I don't want to broaden this beyond what I've saw.
Happen, Marxist nationalists.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't see what's sort of with the flaw. I don't see what's ideological about it.
Before Marx, the labor theory of value was accepted by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. That's where Marx got it from. He obviously made changes in it.
To me, right now, they just look like different ways of thinking about
That
it.
was one of the reasons why a lot of debate among bourgeois economists at the end of the 19th century was the socialists were able to use the labor theory of value to argue against capitalism. Oh, that's complicated. For some of the early marxists were themselves socialists.
And then with the sociological capitalism.
Well, the criticism that's leveled against him is Bukharin conflates. He essentially is using like more the natural sciences in place as opposed to the social sciences. Like Lukács says, Bukharin thinks you can predict a social revolution like a scientific experiment. You know, you add this, you add that, and you get, like, you know how you add hydrogen and oxygen, you get water. That's science, right? And Lukács is saying Bukharin, in developing sociology, or his views on sociology, look at, like, you know, you add this class, you add the, you know, the contradictions of modern society, boom, you suddenly can predict a revolution, which is not quite like that. And it becomes very deterministic in that sense, very fatalistic, where both Lukács and Gramsci were, at least in their early years, were very much, to vulgarize it a little, more on the voluntaristic side of Marxism. They were not very, they were against a lot of the deterministic elements. So, John.
Yeah, I guess one thing maybe more nuanced and another maybe a criticism. It was always my understanding that his dispute with Lenin around the state revolved more around the question of the withering away of the state as opposed to the smashing and breaking up of the state. And that Lenin emphasized very much a very hard class dictatorship that would suppress the bourgeoisie and the counter-revolution. There was a need for the highly centralized, autocratic state to accomplish these tasks. He didn't want to really talk about the withering away of the state, whereas Bukharin, I'd say probably throughout, always had this fear of the Leviathan, okay, and that the Leviathan, okay, and that the question of the withering away of the state needed to be taken up and explained in any theory of the state. And that when you look at state and revolution, it looks like Lenin had caved on that question.
Essentially, he did.
So I thought that was the center of the dispute. I guess that's more of a nuanced.
Yeah, I think a more nuanced. I mean, there are different ways to look at it, but Lenin essentially reinvestigated it after reading Bukharin or engaging in that debate. I mean, the state and the revolution is like such a profound work because, like, as Lenin says in like the introduction, like all these teachings of Marx and Engels on this question are buried aside by the Second International, and he's essentially like unearthing them again after like 20, 30, whatever years. Again, and that was a very controversial position. Yeah, Bukharin was afraid of this new Leviathan and saying smash the state. Lenin wasn't quite emphasizing that to a certain degree until he like reinvestigated the question again.
The other nuance is at Brest-Litovsk, the Germans presented the the ultimatum to the Russian Revolution, and Lenin wanted to sign, there were actually 3 factions
Yes.
instead of 2. And, oh, I don't know, it was probably a third each, or something close to that, where the Bukharin wanted to essentially called for revolutionary war, as you explained. Lenin knew that they were over a barrel and wanted to sign, and Trotsky led the 3rd faction, which was no war, no peace, to just go out there and infect the German troops with propaganda and you know, whatever they could, and also to sort of proclaim to the world the program and the aspirations of the Bolsheviks during the course of the negotiations. So he just wanted to draw out the negotiations as long as he could, and keep the Germans from you know, advancing and slaughtering the Russians.
Yeah.
And so Lenin said, well, we'll go along with that. You know?
No, actually,
so,
Lenin was outvoted, and Trotsky's position held.
yeah,
And then
but
the Germans
Lenin
advanced.
had his faction.
And then they went over to Lenin's position.
Well, it was kind of like as soon as the Germans, you know, started to invade again, then Lenin took a train right up the Brest-Litovsk and signed it without even reading it.
More or less.
But there were 3. I don't know. Lenin, I don't think he was outvoted. I think he just went along with it because he knew the Revolutionary War was just insanity. Bukharin's position, and that he went along with the Trotsky faction just to, you know, to stave off any ideas of the, you know, advancing the world revolution against Germany. So I guess that's my understanding of it. It was a temporary block until the Germans attacked. Then the 2 block, you know, Trotsky agreed that okay, when they attack, we're going to sign. You know, so I saw kind of a deal there where Trotsky said, okay, you go along with this. As soon as they attack, we'll sign.
My understanding was like Trotsky's position was upheld by the Soviet government initially, so no war, no peace, and the Germans essentially thinking the Germans wouldn't advance, that they would be so confounded they just wouldn't do anything. But the Germans called the bluff and started advancing. So Lenin essentially, they re-voted on the question. Lenin's position held out, and they signed the treaty. So, as far as I know, it was, and I actually believe that. I think Stalin actually supported Trotsky in that question. I'm not quite sure. Yes.
So I had to simplify greatly your very thorough talk.
Thanks.
It seems as though we have this incredibly intelligent, theoretically gifted, heroic individual, but at the same time his position in 28, 29, 30 would have led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union when Germany advanced. So at the end of the day, bastard though he might have been, Stalin probably had the correct line.
That might be the case.
So I mean, is that accurate?
You could, yeah, you can argue that. I mean, I'm ultimately not arguing for his positions in that.
Well, so where do you come down on this? I mean, between these 3 positions of...
I mean, the thing is, the positions are not fixed with any of these factions. Stalin's position in like 25 is for Bukharin. 4 years later, it's a new position. It's, you know, it's the 5-year plans and all of that. Trotsky and Brzezinski are different in their views as well, and they change. I mean, it would take a long time for me to go through my positions on this. Yes?
Well, kind of the way I look at that is, you know, if Bukharin's economic policies had been adopted, I don't think anybody can, you know, predict the future about exactly what would happen.
Sure.
I think that the model that was referred to was the dispute between Lenin and Bukharin on the state prior to World War, prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, led to a dynamic where Lenin said he learned from Bukharin and Bukharin said he learned from Lenin. So in other words, you had people with different views, but not splitting, but rather working together and achieving something stronger. And so to me, the point in 1929, 1930 is more that I don't think any one person or camp had all the answers. And I think that when Lenin was alive, everybody was working together. And after Lenin died, they began to split up. And that was the problem. And so I think the better dynamic would have been to adopt the majority position. And this is kind of the Monday morning quarterback, but to adopt the majority position, which I think was Stalin's in 1929 and 30. But to recognize that Bukharin and Rykov, who was a premier, and also Tomsky, who was the head of the trade union, supported Bukharin, as a matter of fact, that they also had a lot to offer.
Sure.
Should not have been eliminated from power, but continued to be part of the discussion so that they could have contributed to help solve problems, you know, that developed with the rapid industrialization model.
I mean,
Should have been like 1917 when Kamenev and Zinoviev opposed the insurrection, but they were main party leaders. Something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess, I mean, also something I didn't quite mention, most of the left opposition goes over to Stalin when the industrialization starts. Priobrzezinski, a lot of them just go over to Stalin. I mean, personally, yeah, I think industrialization, collectivization were necessary. I think, you know, if the peasants are refusing, you know, you have the fact, like, those cities would starve without food. I mean, it's a bad situation no matter how you look at it. I mean, it is Monday morning quarterbacking. I do think, like, yeah, all those people probably should have stayed in the party. I mean, the purges, if nothing else, had a chilling effect. I mean, I don't see the reasonableness of eliminating your best army leaders and your best political leaders, and somehow they're agents of foreign powers who were bad from the beginning. You know, it stifled debate, and that cost the Soviet Union very heavily.
Trotsky repudiated the forced collectivization
Yes.
of agriculture in the 30s, and you know, I don't think that the method that was used was, you know, the only way to do it, or, you know, I think it was horrible, quite frankly. And there were other ways of industrializing besides that. Agriculture was ruined. I mean, to a very large degree. Of course, when you ruined agriculture like that, the grain that went to the cities doubled from prior to Stalin's you know, moves that forced collectivization. I mean, they did get more grain in the cities, but the cost was just horrific. You know, Trotsky did advocate a more patient approach than Stalin by the time of the 30s. And I'll agree with the other two. This is Monday morning quarterbacking, but then, you know, we can't learn from history if we don't do some of that. You know, and I think there were certainly alternatives. I think what the Cubans did was a far better policy toward agriculture than what occurred in the Soviet Union, and even in China, they took a much more nuanced approach, even despite the great leap forward, which didn't last very long. Their agriculture developed, you know, in a much, I would say, a much different way overall than what we saw from Stalin. So I think there are various alternatives that presented themselves in the late 20s, and that, you know, Stalin, you know, had one way to do it, and Trotsky another, and Bukharin another. There were probably 3 or 4 other ways as well.
I mean, of course there were alternatives. Of course there were different ways. The other thing that we have to understand is no one had ever tried this before. No one had ever before this tried to make a modern industrial socialist economy with collectivized agriculture. These were the first people to do it.
Under a state of siege,
under a state of siege, of course, yeah. So, in an uneducated, largely backward peasant country, all, you know, the problems of setting up a modern planning system, developing industry, doing it, again, under the state of siege before a war that they all expected was going to come. I mean, it wouldn't have been utopia no matter who did it, and no matter how. I mean, it could certainly, you know, differences existed, there were different paths. But those problems were going to exist no matter who was at the helm of the Soviet state. Sure, you know, maybe under Trotsky there would have been no purges. Maybe under Bukharin there would have been no purges. Would they have been able to stave off the threat of war? I don't know.
Nazis would have been defeated if it wasn't for the Stalin's
Well,
International.
I mean, yeah,
Socialist
this is
communists
assuming
were
all
bigger
of,
than the
this is
Nazi
again
Party.
assuming, I mean, we could play like alternate history. I mean, the other thing that I think is like, a lot of the discussion on the alternative policies of the 20s, in my mind, get to a lot of wishful thinking about what the particular participants stood for. If you're a very extreme, like, anti-revisionist, Trotsky was just a worse, wanted to, like, launch the armies against, like, every state in the world. Or, Bukharin was a conscious counter-revolutionary, when this is not quite the case. They had very nuanced, developed positions of their own. And the other thing is, no matter how nuanced or developed your position is, reality can overtake it. We don't quite know how they would have reacted if they were in power. Yes?
To what extent are we paying the price today, do you think, with the rise of fascism in Ukraine? The forced collectivization.
Oh, man.
I'm just thinking of let's play the dialectic back.
That is such a...
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I mean, first of all, if you're on a strike, you're refusing to deliver food to the state, I think you should be dealt with.
Yeah.
In that sense. And the fact is it wasn't just, suddenly collectivization. Like, the Ukrainians a lot of them had opposed the Soviet state from the beginning, in 1917, 1918. And there was alienation, of course the state certainly compounded some of those problems, but a lot of them willingly collaborated with the Nazis, during the war. I mean, what do you want, And, there were problems with, I like the Maoist idea that Stalin handled contradictions among the people as contradictions, with the enemy, antagonistically, which was a problem, and how they dealt with a lot of the peasantry and the working class. But, I don't think it's fair or even really Marxist to put all the blame on Stalin for this. A lot of these people were not interested in allying with the Soviet Union, were not interested in collectivizing agriculture. They were, very right-wing, and they were willing to ally with the Germans at the end of World War I and during World War II as well. They're not interested in socialism.
I guess you could put a bit of blame on Khrushchev because he's the one who took the Crimea out of Russia.
Yeah, I guess it's
One
a
is a
whole
whole
other.
other discussion.
That's a whole other discussion. Any other questions, comments, concerns, objections?
That was really impressive.
Okay, next month is James Connolly, the Irish socialist, leader of the Easter Uprising on March 2nd, I think. No, August 2nd.
So August 2nd.
Whatever the first Saturday of August is. I believe it's the 2nd. Someone can correct
Doug,
me.
are you planning to do Lukács at some point in the series?
Ooh, that's it.
He is now.
You piqued my curiosity with your
That'll be...
putting him into the equation. Yeah.
I was actually planning on doing Prebrzezinski at some point.
Fine, I'll be
But
here.
yeah, Lukács is a good one. Okay, all right. Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the talk. You got something out of it. Again, donate to the Center for Marxist Education, and hope to see many of you again
This one
next
around,
month.
I guess. Yeah.
Good job,
Thank you, Doug.